Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor de Graffenried. Welcome to the Asia Initiative Lecture Series at the Institute of World Politics. My name is Amanda Wan, and I'm the founder and coordinator of the Asia Initiative Lecture Series. For those who are new to the Institute of World Politics, IWP is a graduate school of statecraft, national security, international affairs, and intelligence. We have a doctoral program as well as 5 master's programs and 18 certificates of graduate study and a continuing education program. The objective of this lecture series is to broaden the scope and discussion on a range of intelligence, foreign policy, and security issues attendant to the Asian geopolitical, socioeconomic, and cultural spheres of influence. Today, we have a fascinating speaker, IWP Professor Emeritus Kenneth D. de Graffenried, who will be presenting a lecture on 70 years of Chinese strategic intelligence threats. Professor de Graffenried has over 40 years of leadership responsibility as a senior national level expert, practitioner, writer, and teacher in the areas of strategic defense and intelligence policy and operations, counterintelligence and protective security, continuity of operations and infrastructure, cyber, telecommunications, and information protection. He has served as a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Deputy National Counterintelligence Executive, and Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs as White House Senior Director of Intelligence and Security Programs on the Ronald Reagan National Security Council. A retired Navy captain, he also served on the professional staff of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He has been a senior group VP of an R&D and systems engineering firm and a VP of a high-level policy analysis firm supporting sensitive USG programs in counterintelligence, telecommunications, and security. As Professor Emeritus at IWP, a graduate school in Washington, D.C., where he developed and directed the first MA degree in intelligence and security studies to be offered in the United States. Currently, he is a distinguished fellow in intelligence studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. Thank you, Professor de Graffenried, for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Amanda, and thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be back at IWP, if only through the magic of our Zoom. And so here we are. A warm welcome to all of you who are looking in on your Zoom. I just learned from Amanda that a number of my former teachers are in the audience, and so I'm a little sheepish, but I'll give it a shot here anyway. Professors Tierney and Shulsky, and also Professor Eftiamatis, and others. So I encourage any of you to interrupt me if I get off track here. Well, this afternoon we're going to be talking about, it's kind of a big title, 70 years of Chinese strategic intelligence threats. I guess the summary thing is there have been 70 years of it, and it's getting worse. So I'm going to try to hit some highlights as we go. But I do have to say a few words about, in truth in advertising here. When I was in graduate school in the late 1960s and early 70s, one of my professors at Catholic University was specializing in Chinese communist theory and revolutionary movements. And I was forced to take a number of courses in that, which were, I have to say, looking back on it, quite painful. So I am now back talking about China. And there is one incident that I must confess to. A few years after that, I was working on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And while I was there, I got, a number of us got invited to go to Taiwan by a university in Taiwan. And they flew us out there. In those days, you could take those kind of junkets. And as part of the the visit to Taiwan, we were flown out by the Republic of China Air Force to the island of Quemoy, which is an offshore island very close to the Chinese mainland. Very interesting because there had been quite a number of incidents there in the Taiwan Straits in the 1950s, which I knew about from reading about them. And so we got out there. It's a beautiful island. They got they grow sorghum there, so everything smells very sweet. But the thing was honeycombed with defensive positions. And at one point, I think we're all invited, but I apparently took the invitation, and we launched. I launched a propaganda balloon at the mainland. In earlier times, the PRC and the ROC sent these balloons toward each other, but they had explosives or weapons on them. But by the time I was there, that had changed, and they were just little packages of toys and candy for children. So I launched it, and a couple days later, in the paper, there was my picture launching this propaganda balloon at the mainland. So I don't know whether they remember that, but I suspect they do. So I'll get on with this. In 1949, to the surprise of many Americans who had hoped, I think, that World War II had marked the end of major world conflict, the Soviet Union, who had been our ally in World War II, exploded a nuclear weapon, which turned out to be identical to the bomb that the US had dropped on Nagasaki. And it was identical because the bomb's nuclear technology had been stolen through massive espionage by America's Russian communist wartime ally. And this event was one of the events that threw cold water on the idea that the post-World War II period was going to be easy. And instead, it ushered in a new conflict in which nuclear weapons and strategic intelligence operations would be the framework for what would be a 50-year conflict between the United States and its allies and the Soviets. But also in 1949, the People's Republic of China came into existence, having defeated the nationalist regime who fled to Taiwan, and began pursuing what has come to be a very similar hegemonic course, also relying, as it turns out, on stolen nuclear weapons design for achieving its own strategic nuclear capabilities, and also engaging in strategic intelligence activities. So I want to go over some of that today. And first, I want to clearly the Chinese foreign policy development during this period was different than the Soviet one, but there are many, many similarities because we are going to talk about intelligence, and in doing so, we have to talk about the nature of how the People's Republic of China, views intelligence. And in many ways, it is very similar to the way the Soviet Union did, and to some extent to the way Russia, post-Soviet Russia, views intelligence, which is not the way America looks at intelligence for the most part. To the United States, intelligence is a necessary ingredient of the tools of foreign policy, but it is not at the center of our foreign policy, to be sure, and therefore the organizations and missions of American intelligence are somewhat limited in what they are to achieve, but not so with the either the Russians, the Soviets, or the PRC. And so I'm going to try to make a couple points about that before I get into kind of tracing some of the events of this long 70-year period. And while many Americans today, I suspect, are not used to viewing China as a strategic power with many threats for the United States, preferring, I think, to see it as at worst, a benign commercial competitor. But in fact, the PRC's intelligence operations and activities reflect a much more ambitious national strategic goal, which I think many of us can see now is to help get the People's Republic to the point of being the number one power, certainly in Asia, but perhaps in the world. And for that, they will, I'm sure we would agree, would use their intelligence tools in furtherance of that. And we generally don't think of that. I mean, we as a United States, as a society, don't think about, well, we're going to advance ourselves into a number one position. To the extent that the U.S. has achieved that status, it was the result of the accumulation of other and the drives of other purposes. But I think we see in China a much more purposeful and planned strategic effort to certainly to bring China into modern times in terms of technology, industry, economy, military power. And one of the ways that that is done is through the use of their intelligence services. But I think we need to go back a minute and note, and here there is a similarity with the old Soviet Union, the nature of intelligence in a revolutionary communist movement. When the Soviets took power in what was essentially a coup d'etat in 1917, the Bolsheviks had a history of very involved as a conspiratorial revolutionary movement, and they knew all about intelligence operations because they were the target of certainly the Tsarist Okhrana secret police, and they themselves, because they were trying to survive in that revolutionary environment, used intelligence, they used intelligence more in the way of that a secret police would. They had a secret police chasing them, and they used all of those kinds of techniques that secret organizations did. And that continued when the Cheka, which later became the KGB, rose to its position of prominence within the Soviet system. That was because it was being used to protect the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And in all of the techniques of the sort of the nastier side of intelligence were free game to the Soviet intelligence service. And we see that is true as well in China. When during the rise of the Communist Party in China, they were also a conspiratorial political movement, revolutionary political movement, which was very much competing with the Kuomintang, and almost in one incident in 1927, as I recall, they were almost put out of business, but they slipped the leash a bit and were not caught. And Mao and his fellow revolutionaries went on to fight another day and eventually to win. But the thought of being eliminated, and literally eliminated, I think gave both the Bolsheviks and Mao's army, the PLA, and his co-conspirators, a sense of how important the tools of intelligence and counterintelligence, secrecy, and penetration of opposition groups, how important that was. This wasn't just a democracy with an intelligence service like the United States. It was the very life and death matter to both of these parties. And I think that goes a long way toward coloring the nature of both Soviet and Chinese, PRC now intelligence operations, because that's the history they came from. The third piece is that China, different somewhat from than Russia and the Soviet Union, has, because of the nature of Chinese society and culture, they have a strategic tradition going back millennia. Sun Tzu, who talks about a lot of intelligence matters and the importance of deception and all of the techniques of intelligence, he's as relevant in China today as he was in 500 BC. And that's a long tradition. And that combined with the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary movements in China is a big factor in thinking about what the Chinese intelligence services look like and what they do and their role within the Communist Party. These are not adjuncts. These are not service functions. They are pillars, as was the KGB in the old Soviet Union. They were pillars of the society and the government, because their job in the old Soviet thing was the sword and shield of the party. Their job was to keep the presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party in power, which is a much different job than the CIA has, or the FBI, or Army intelligence. So that is to be noted. There's another dimension to the particular histories in both the Soviet Union and in communist China, and that has to do with, and I'm no psychologist, so I can't tell you how big a deal this plays in things, but both the Stalinist period in Russia and Mao's time and the Great Leap Forward and the Great People's Cultural Revolution a few years later were events in which millions of their fellow countrymen died. The numbers are debated today, but during the Stalinist period, it was scores of millions, and the estimates for the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s, early 60s, and then a few years later, the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution, estimates there of 45 million in the first instance and 20 million of their own countrymen killed. Now, I don't know if that's a factor, but we don't have anything like that. And most of our Western allies don't have a history like that, other than World War II. And of course, if you go back to World War I, which were terrible bloodlettings, but they were against enemies for the most part. Um, in um, in these two instances, the Soviets and the Chinese Communists, those were um, deaths that resulted from uh, political decisions of the regimes. And so the Chinese Communist regime today um, is the regime that succeeded, well, not succeeded, just continued on from those events. And I don't know what all that means for intelligence exactly, but I do think it is a factor um, in what the way they are today. Well, um, the Chinese approach to intelligence, therefore, is tied to the party. It is strategic in the sense that if you're looking at Sun Tzu or you're looking at what has been done since the 1920s within the Chinese Communist Party, these are absolutely essential capabilities to staying in power. And the and their names have changed. There are some good books out now, studies, which there weren't a few years ago. I think I mentioned Professor Efkiamatis. He's got his classic book of Chinese intelligence operations, and he's got some new, smaller volumes bringing things up to date. And there's a fine book by Peter Mattis and Matthew Brazil on Chinese communist espionage, a primer, and other associated books, the Tao of intelligence activities and the Tao of deception, which go back into Chinese, way back thousands of years into Chinese history. But the modern ones take apart and look at the actual organizations and individuals in a lot of cases, and we know a lot more about that than we did just a few years ago. So the Ministry of State Security, which wasn't created immediately when China came into PRC came into existence in 1949. I don't think we see the MSS coming into being until about 1983. But it took all of the parts, counterintelligence and security, and all of the pieces that had been there for a while, the investigations department of the Central Committee, and wrapped them up into a new secret police intelligence organization. We have here in this country, we've got a foreign intelligence service, and we've got a domestic police investigative organization, the FBI, which also does some counterintelligence. But we don't have a combined, all-encompassing Ministry of State Security, which is responsible for it all. And if you look at the new material, which I'm not going to have time to go over these organizational charts and things today, the current Chinese intelligence activities have proliferated. It's not just the Ministry of State Security. Obviously, the defense side, which used to be the second bureau of the PLA, is now the Intelligence Bureau of the Joint Staff Department. And so in the last 20 years, the Chinese intelligence service has matured and proliferated, and also become more specific to functions. So the third, what used to be the 3 PLA that did SIGINT, now there's all kinds of organizations within the Chinese government that do that. The important thing, however, that we want to say about all of this is that when we look at China as a threat to the United States, or to the West, we're not looking at just an intelligence service. We are looking at an approach to strategic growth on the part of the PRC that encompasses what is referred to as the whole of society approach. Not only do they have intelligence services, and they have intelligence officers in the United States who are covered as diplomats, but they also have all kinds of other collection and intelligence influence activities from other organizations that run the gamut from private individuals who just are, I won't even say co-opted, they're just encouraged to conduct activities on behalf of China in a way that we don't quite see in the West for the most part. There are any number of companies and would appear in a U.S. context to be private firms, which are private firms, but they are also at the very same time a element of Chinese intelligence collection and or influence operations. So it's a different construct than we see because it is far more encompassing. And so second big difference is the sheer size of the intelligence capabilities across this whole of society that we see in the PRC. The CIA is a tiny little organization certainly compared to the MSS and to all of these other outfits, which counterparts don't really exist in a lot of cases in our context. And then to that, we have to add what has happened also in the last 20 years has been the rise of cyber. And the Chinese have become very, very good at cyber intelligence operations, influence operations, collection, and disruption, and any number of things. I want to go back, though, to yet another comparison to the Soviets. It took a long time for the United States government and the American society to come to realize the Soviet Union was the threat that it in fact was. And one of the reasons for that was that there were a lot of Americans who played down, for whatever reasons, they played down the nature of the Soviet threat. And we see that in the case of China as well. We certainly saw it during right after World War II, at the time the Civil War was going on in China, and for time after that, with and this, without putting a political spin on it, this was many cases left supporting individuals, publications that were simply not taking the threat at the time, let alone now, as seriously as it was warranted. And there was a lot of political fighting about that in the 1950s, particularly with regard to what were called the China hands and all of this. And there were all kinds of political charges about who lost China and all of these things, which of course scrambled and muddied the issue. But the fact was there were a lot of people who, particularly people who had served in China and were not particularly enamored of the Chiang Kai-shek regime, and who showed at least some tolerance, if not sympathy, for the Chinese communists. And that was a factor in probably the intensity with which we, as a country, looked at the intelligence threat from China at the time. Now that records have been opened and there's more material available, we know that there was a steady stream of successful Chinese intelligence operations against the U.S. The most famous in those early years was a CIA employee by the name of Larry Wu Tai Chin, who had started working for the Americans during World War II as a translator for the U.S. Army. And he continued to do that and gradually was promoted and finally went with CIA and was a conscious Chinese intelligence agent until he was unmasked. And he wound up committing suicide in prison while awaiting sentencing, I believe. And there have been a number of other important intelligence events that occurred following that in the 80s, with the expulsion of several Chinese intelligence officers, diplomatically covered, who were attempting to get NSA material, and this continues on until we get into the 1970s. From the 70s on into the 80s, when we come to find out, although we don't know how, that the Chinese intelligence services had, in fact, gotten the plans for every one of the U.S. nuclear weapons designs, which, at least putatively, were the most carefully guarded secrets in the American government. And we still don't know how that was done fully. A few years after my other touchings with Chinese events, I worked with what was called the Cox Committee. It was in the late 1990s, a committee of the Congress, a bipartisan committee of the Congress that looked into Chinese acquisition of American technology, particularly nuclear technology, but also space and computer technology. This was a major study by the Congress back in the days when the Congress did those kinds of things. And that was over 20 years ago. And the report, that Cox report, lists an entire agonizing history of how the Chinese were successful in outwitting the United States in all of these areas. And the report had a whole list of recommendations. It went to the president, all kinds of potential for getting some of these problems under control, lack of security, for example, at the nuclear labs, the nuclear research labs. And here we are 20 some years later, and that book is as evergreen as it was then, except more stuff has happened. And so I guess what I'm particularly at some pains today to talk about is what we can do at this point, given some of these efforts by the Chinese. The first thing we need to talk about is the lack of understanding of what it means to deal with a nation that is operating, if you will, strategically, where it is putting its efforts in terms of intelligence collection, in terms of acquisition of technology, and all of these other things to advance itself to a position of prominence and perhaps probably parity with the United States strategically and politically in the world. Politically is a little harder, but certainly the efforts to acquire these technologies and this information is a fundamental kind of challenge. And if we don't understand it at that level, which was the point of the Cox report, if we don't understand that at that level, then it's going to be very hard to do anything about it, other than to do piecemeal responses. So our counterintelligence today, for example, remains, for the most part, case-driven. There's indications of espionage, and the FBI goes to investigate, and it treats it as a case, which it needs to do at, if you want to call it the tactical level. But at the strategic level, there's no indication that we have taken this Chinese threat of all of these activities in cyber, in technology transfer, in cultural infiltration, that we've taken these seriously at the strategic level. And that's the precursor of doing anything serious about this. For the most part, the United States hasn't, in its intelligence activities, particularly its counterintelligence activities, hasn't acted in a strategic way. We did for, probably 20 years in the middle of the Cold War. We did treat the KGB as a strategic threat and went after it in the counterintelligence sense strategically, and to some effect, some good effect. But it's not clear that we have done that at all with the Chinese threat. When I was at the National Counterintelligence Executive, using this same kind of thinking, we said, well, shouldn't there be a way to design a strategic counterintelligence effort on the part of the United States to thwart what was then apparent the Chinese were up to? And we came up with some ideas. Most of them faltered, however, on the fact that in the nature of the bureaucratic government of the United States, particularly in the national security side, there's not a premium on thinking strategically, particularly if a particular department or agency or bureau feels that would be taking away from its resources or its prominence or its ability to call the shots in certain areas. So when I left that job, we had made something of an effort in the case of China, and then I was gone from there. And then a few years later, we see what has happened with what happened in 2010 and 11 with all U.S. human operations in China got rolled up. This is as bad as what happened with regard to our American intelligence ops in Cuba, where they all got doubled by the Cuban DGI, and in East Germany during the Cold War, where the same thing happened. And one doesn't want to be too critical, but those things, those kinds of failures, are not just failures of particular times and places. They really reveal a failure to look broadly in a strategic way at what's going on. In part, the problem is doing the case-by-case method as opposed to doing a strategic approach. One of the first things we would probably need to do is realize that in addition to the United States being a big target, a principal target of Chinese intelligence operations, broadly speaking, the whole of society approach, the Chinese have a very specific problem called Taiwan. And so an enormous amount of their effort goes into intelligence activities, both collection, influence, propaganda, all of the other dark arts of intelligence aimed at Taiwan. And so that fact needs to be realized in the senior councils of the government in order to be able, if one wanted to mount a strategic counterintelligence response to one would need to say, well, now look, if they're pointed at Taiwan and a lot of their effort is going there, maybe that's an area where we could have some effect with our counterintelligence activities. So another factor, another that we could use in our effort to do something about this strategy is to fashion the American government to be able to respond to these things. One reason that we deal in stovepipe solutions is because we're a government of stovepipes. And in theory, at least, the original idea in the 1947 Act of the National Security Council was that there would be a place and a process for bringing these issues together in dealing with them across the government. That, if I had a recommendation to the new administration, it would be that to take seriously this threat and therefore configure the government in order to do this. Putting one person in charge of something is not necessarily the answer, but having a process for defining the nature of the threat, which is an important first step, and then thinking about, well, what does this mean to us? What about the Chinese strategic effort is it that's harmful to the U.S.? For the Chinese to modernize is certainly not a mortal threat to the United States. In fact, it's a good thing. But to do it by the theft of American technology, either through espionage or influence operations, or as we covered in the old Cox report, the kind of just simple corruption of buying people to do that is not good. And to go back to a point that I was making a little earlier, we also need a place inside the government, within the administration, to be able to openly and clearly state what the goal of all of this is. I mentioned that I thought that there was a lot of political support, certainly in the 50s, and on what I would say ideological reasons, for downplaying the nature of at that time, the Chinese threat. But today, that kind of political support is in the form of business interests, which say, well, look, our interest really is in China, in the economic relations, in trade relations. Well, that's fine, but that needs to be tempered with an understanding that we are also losing a lot of American assets because we're not being serious about this. And that is one of the challenges, this whole of society approach that is done to coordinate these things. When this kind of problem was first identified or was first addressed back in the Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviets, there was a whole range of things that were done. In terms of technology transfer, there were diplomatic regimes with our allies, the COCOM and some of these other structures that were created precisely to address it as a international issue, at least from our side. And that bled into the government when we were dealing with what was known in those days as Soviet active measures, which were Soviet political propaganda and other active measures activities. There was an effort made to, one, work with our allies on this, but also to address it in a broader way. And it's not the job of the FBI alone to deal with those kinds of things. In some cases, it isn't the FBI's job at all, but it's somebody's job. And when the organization, well, not really an organization, but a coordinating effort called the Active Measures Working Group was put together in the mid-'80s to deal with that, it went much broader than simply the intelligence and security elements of the national security bureaucracy. It went to everybody. It got from the diplomatic through the information and on around through the government. And that was an effective effort. It didn't stop Soviet acquisition of American technology completely, but it certainly did some. And now the Chinese effort in that regard is much, much broader, and it would require a creative new structure to deal with that. And it's not a one-sided thing. I mean, it does not mean we don't trade with China. It doesn't mean that all forms of technology sharing are bad, but it does say, look, think about this before you do it. And certainly a situation in which we have today, where we've lost the designs to, or had compromised to China, all of our nuclear weapons designs and many, many other weapon systems, that needs to be stopped in some way. A number of cases, I don't want to bore you with all these cases that have come up over the past few years. A couple of very bad ones were the Chimac case, the Monteperto case at DIA, and as I alluded to, the horrible situation, which reportedly, since I don't know anything about it officially, the perhaps up to a score of American sources were discovered and executed through mistakes that we had made. And today, I think probably one of our biggest problems, apart from the huge and variegated nature of the human intelligence threat, is cyber. And my sense is that there is some attempt within our NSA and Cyber Command to understand this problem and do something about it. But it's, as we all know, it changes constantly, and it's a race between the offense and defense in all of these things. Amanda, could I take some questions?
Thank you, Professor DeGraffenreid, for such an insightful lecture, and we'll take questions now.
Okay.
So if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A chat box. The first question we have is from Professor Tinnery. Do you believe that China will represent a similar threat to the West as the Soviet Union did, greater or less?
Well, I think I'm going to say, he's my old professor, so I've got to give him an answer, and I'll say greater. I think that the Soviets had a number of shortcomings in their political system and in what they were trying to do vis-a-vis the West, if you want to call it that, that the Chinese do not necessarily have. And the Chinese appear to have a long-term strategy, and it's well thought out. I mean, this is not just a belligerent Stalin or Brezhnev, kind of blindly setting forth strategic utterances about what they were doing, the Brezhnev doctrine. This is the Chinese are much more, I think, thoughtful, and now they've got some, Belt and Road Initiative and building little islands in the South China Sea, and all of these specific things can be outrageous and threatening in their own, but they're going somewhere with this. So I guess my answer is I think they're more, in part because they have this several thousand year strategic understanding, that I think they're more of a threat. But it's not, Khrushchev is not rattling his rockets. We don't see that today, although we have had certain threats about losing Los Angeles to save Taiwan. But I do think they're more sophisticated and therefore more dangerous. And I think that cyber shows that. They're very good at cyber. And so Professor Tierney, I think the Chinese are more of a threat than were the Soviets at a comparable stage in history.
Thank you. And the next question is, how were the American leaders deceived by the Soviet Communist Party and the Chinese Communist Party successively and repeatedly? FDR saved Stalin, Nixon saved Mao, Bush and Clinton saved Jiang, Biden will save Xi.
Say the last part again, Amanda.
Biden will save the current Chinese president Xi.
I guess it's hard to argue against that analysis there. Americans are Americans, and it's very hard for us to be on what I would call a strategic mission in the world to counter, in this case, the PRC, because there are so many other factors involved. And we do reach out. I mean, the United States does in that sense. And these regimes do get, if you want to say, was the word you used, rescued? In a way, they do get rescued. And probably just, I think my observation of my years in the government is that most government officials, I'm not talking about the senior ones necessarily, but although some days, they don't feel right about triumphing in a particular geopolitical situation. There's always the thought, well, we need to leave these guys a way out. We need to do this. And I think that, I'm not sure what motive, which part of the American political psyche that represents, but I do think it is very, much a factor. I don't know how much, but a factor in why it seems that the communist regimes get let off the hook, if you want to say that. Although ultimately they don't get let off the hook, but yeah, it's a question of we have, I think, an innate thing that our goal is to turn adversaries into friends, and friends into allies. Well, if you're up against somebody that's not their goal, they can have a certain advantage from that. But I think the questioner is correct in that. If you looked at one way, the U.S. did not do everything it could. Now, certainly in the case of the PRC, the United States spent years and lots of treasure trying to help save the nationalist KMT regime over and against the communists, and they weren't successful, and we weren't successful in our effort to do that.
Thank you. And the next question is from an IWP professor. This question is, what is your assessment of China's continued efforts to establish Confucius Institutes on American academic premises? And the follow-up question is, you also mentioned that the U.S. was not adopting a strategic policy as regards countering the Chinese threat. Wasn't it the job of NCIS to come up with a strategy?
Yeah, save that second one. Let me get through the first one. For the CI Institute, Confucius Institute, I do think that those are, and of course, the reason that that's such, in one sense, a dangerous technique, dangerous to us by the Chinese, is there's a lot of good that comes from those things. But if those are used for, in effect, whole of society influence operations on American campuses, then we have a right to think about that and decide, is the good we're getting worth the bad we're getting? And I would have to say that from what I know, and again, I'm not been in the government in a while, the Confucius Institutes are on net a dangerous thing. And I think the last administration tried to do something about that. I think they're a problem. Give me the next one's a little trickier. What?
Sure. So the second one was, you mentioned that the U.S. was not adopting a strategic policy as regards countering the Chinese threat. Wasn't that the job of NCIS to come up with a strategy?
In part, it was. And I think I alluded to the fact that some years ago, when I was there, we were actually trying to do that with regard to what the NCIX had, which is kind of a more limited perspective, but one having to do with all counterintelligence, which is a pretty big perspective. But that is not the same as a national policy, a la, for example, the containment policy that grew out of the National Security Council debates of the NSC 68 or whatever it was, a more formal adoption by the U.S. government, broadly speaking, of a Cold War strategy of containment. Now, I know it's subject to all kinds of interpretations, and a lot of people thought, well, the containment strategy wasn't all that effective. But there was an instance where that was more than a pure counterintelligence task. But you're right, the NCIX should have been doing that. And as I say, I can at least assert to you at one point we were trying to do that. The problem with the NCIX, which is often a problem within the American government, is that for what may be the most wonderful of reasons, many of the departments and agencies and bureaus did not want to cede any of their authority and or resources to the NCIX, saying, I mean, the FBI's answer was, well, we do counterintelligence. What are you guys telling us? You know, what's NCIX got to do with? And of course, from a bureaucratic point of view, I understand what they're saying, but in terms of trying to take a strategic approach, the Bureau's vision, the FBI's vision of what good counterintelligence and effective counterintelligence against the Chinese does not automatically equate to a strategic approach to counterintelligence vis-a-vis the Chinese intelligence. It's a more limited thing. And when the Congress wrote the Counterintelligence Act of 2001 or 2002 that established the NCIX, the idea, the kernel of idea there was precisely to have a place where you could deal with, develop and deal with and promulgate a national counterintelligence policy. A lot of the departments and agencies did not want to do that, and it was very hard to achieve that. And I think just a footnote here, and I'm not being defensive, but you will notice that the mission of the National Counterintelligence Executive, which is now name's been broadened, because the everything but the smile on the cat has disappeared. Counterintelligence isn't what they do anymore. They do security things, all of them important. They do a bunch of other related activities, which in a perfect system would all be done. But the idea of focusing on counterintelligence, which was the purpose of that bill and that law, has disappeared. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to get too hot about that one.
He's actually asking, so would you assess NCIX as a failed effort?
Well, I think if one is judging by the plain words of the, I'm getting my numbers wrong here, but I think the statute was the National Counterintelligence Act of, I think maybe 2002 might be a more accurate number. It was written in 2001. If you judge it by what is written in the plain words, yes, it has failed in that mission. It may do some other things, and there have been other good things being done, and there are probably good things being done this afternoon, but it did not produce a national counterintelligence strategy worthy of the word strategy. Now, the first couple of written strategies were pretty good. It's just that the elements of the counterintelligence community did not want to buy into that. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. And so, sorry.
Thank you. And the next question is, given the current political climate, both stateside and globally, the recent events, do you think professionally and personally that China could succeed in becoming the world power? If so, do you think Russia would alter their allegiances policies to pose a threat to the US or the West?
Can you repeat the second part? Well, let's try that one more time, Amanda. I'm trying to.
Given the current political climate, both stateside and globally, the recent events, do you think professionally and personally that China could succeed in becoming the world power?
Well, it's certainly on its way to becoming a world power. Being the world power is a pretty tall order for anybody. Even the US, which I think didn't seek that position, but sort of got it as a result of a variety of factors. So I don't know necessarily that it's going to become the one. For one thing, as I think the second part of your question, there is Russia. and there is the United States. I mean, the United States has not folded its tent. I've, I've indicated we have a ways to go in dealing with the strategic threat, particularly in the intelligence area, which in the case of China is a very broad area, much broader than it is to us. But we haven't withdrawn from that struggle. I noticed the new DCI Ambassador Burns. He's got an article out about how to, countering China, and it's got a whole bunch of sensible, tough things to do. So, the United States is not withdrawing from the Pacific. And as we've seen in the Taiwan area and in the Straits, South China Sea, East China Sea, the United States has not withdrawn from that. In fact, we're making sure that our presence is known there. And so I think, the Chinese they're on the make, if you will. And given that has a societal dimension to it, it's very powerful. In my few visits there and talking to Chinese about this subject, there are many Chinese who want China to be the number one power. They may not necessarily be dyed-in-the-wool, Marxists and supporters of the current regime, which in some cases privately they're not, but they are. They like the idea of China being number one, and that's a big deal in all of this. But just wanting that and just doing the things that the Chinese are doing, it doesn't necessarily have to come to be. And particularly if, what actually that means. Having China as a major power does not necessarily mean that that's a threat to the United States. It's only a threat to the United States if it's a threat to the United States. And so there's a lot of room there. Did I waffle that answer well enough, Amanda?
I think so. We actually have a question from IWP President Dr. John Lanchowski. He says, too many former cabinet members have been directly or indirectly on Beijing's payroll, helping American businesses to open doors in China. These figures are key to downplaying the threat from the CCP. Is there a way to prevent this kind of work, perhaps by legislation?
Well, Dr. Lanchowski is certainly correct that there are an awful lot of people on today, Americans who are on, in one form or another, China's payroll. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're putting their finger on the scale in the wrong way, but it's still an ominous situation. I don't know how legislatively or that, prevents that. It's you say it's a free country. If you want to go to work for a Chinese firm, I think, and advance their cause, that's every individual's choice. But there's certainly a lot of that going on. I talked to one gentleman who was at a meeting, and he said he looked around the table and he said, I realized I was the only one who wasn't on the Chinese payroll. And he was at a fairly senior level of a corporation. And what he meant by that is that many of the other people around the table in one form or another were getting support, financial and otherwise, from the Chinese. Where this is clandestine or covert or hidden, I think that is a place for legislation, and for enforcement. And we've seen that at several universities where there have been a couple of recent scandals where professors have not declared the fact that they're getting, massive amounts of money from a Chinese entity. Well, why are they hiding that? Well, they're hiding it because it's embarrassing to them. And so I think those rules, and I'm not an expert on those by any means, could be tightened up a bit. But, it's a free country. If you want to go to work for the Chinese, it's hard for I don't think we as a country can say no. But it's a little too convenient now to receive support from the People's Republic of China, which seems innocuous, or may seem, or you can argue that it's innocuous, but it really isn't. Not innocuous. It's if you're getting a lot of money from somebody, which is why we have, generally in our laws and procedures, the appearance of conflict of interest. Not just conflict of interest, but the appearance of conflict of interest is a factor. And I think in some cases people have gone way over the line in the hidden appearance of conflict of interest. Thank you, Dr. Lanchowski.
Thank you, Dr. Lanchowski, for joining us today. And the next question is, do you feel that the character and nature of Chinese intelligence efforts against the U.S. has changed in the last few years, and if so, how?
One more time, Amanda.
Sure. Do you feel that the character and nature of Chinese intelligence efforts against the U.S. has changed in the last few years, and if so, how?
I would bow to Professor Efthymiadis and some of the other experts, but I do. I think first of all, the Chinese intelligence operations are more ubiquitous, and they're in all different kinds of places. Are they more sophisticated and polished than they were 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Probably. We saw that with the KGB. It used to be the case in the early days of the Cold War that your standard KGB guy was kind of thuggish, to put not too nice a spin on it. But by the end of the Cold War, they had very, very sophisticated intelligence officers, both in terms of influence operations and in terms of recruiting of spies and running spies. I would suspect that if people that deal with this on an everyday basis would say the same is true for the MSS and the people from the whatever it's now called, the old 2PLA, the military intelligence. Because one of the things about these communist regimes, is they got a lot of intelligence services, and not just one. And that goes for Russia today. The GRU has a whole set of activities, illegals, all kinds of activities that mirror what is being done by the SVR and the FSB. So those are three major Russian outfits that are out there causing trouble. And I think that's true in the case of the Chinese. And, the Chinese, the Ministry of State Security, there is this, and I don't know, I again, about a Professor Efthymiadis about this, but at least a few years ago, the various provinces also ran their own intelligence operations. Like, Kansas would have its own intelligence service. And the big one is the Shanghai State Security Bureau, traditionally because of the diplomatic nature and the position and everything. But they have, wholly owned subsidiaries of people doing things. And, one of them is dedicated, of course, to Taiwan. But there's just a lot of intelligence outfits. And so in that sense, not only is it probably more sophisticated, there's just a lot more of it. And Does that necessarily mean it's better? No, but they've been pretty effective, and it's certainly the case that it does not appear that it certainly appears that their counterintelligence has successfully blunted American collection activities. Now, I think American intelligence still knows a lot about what's going on in China, particularly with weapon systems and cyber capabilities and others. But I suspect our human operations are not all that keen today. I know one thing: when I was back I think I can say this, when I was back in the business, that because we agreed to, in the case of terrorism, we agreed to cooperate, as we do with other nations in counter-terrorist events, activities. And so we agreed to do that with the People's Republic of China and the MSS. And, I assume, passed things and they passed things. But the issue there, of course, is that their idea of counterterrorism, namely against their own Uyghur population, is not what we would call terrorists. I'm not falling back on, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, but so that became a problem for us. And then it also became a problem because there again, the Chinese were not above using the leverage. And by the way, same as the Soviets with regard to counterterrorism. Both, and the Russians, let me update them. All of those outfits were more than willing to leverage our attempts at cooperation in the field of counterterrorism with getting their way in other areas and probably blunting things that they didn't want us doing. Did that answer that? I hope that answered that.
Sure. And the next question is from Professor Epimedis. Why
Yes.
has the USG been unable to marshal a response to China at a strategic level? Is it even possible for us to effectively counter China?
Well, I'll answer the second question. It's the easy one. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Is it likely to happen in the foreseeable future? Realistically, I don't see it. I mean, look, there is in this American democracy, there is a political dimension to the things that we do in these things, and it took a long while. That was what I was alluding to at the beginning. It took a long while for the United States politically to decide that Soviet intelligence and the KGB and all of the associated activities was something that we really wanted to be against. And even then, there were people on what I would say the left side of the political spectrum who they really didn't want to do that. And so, you have to marshal a certain critical mass of political opinion, public opinion, among the leaders in order to get, a national, if you want to call it for a democracy, a national strategy, even in this limited area. Eventually that happened with regard to the Soviets, although it was never 100%. We had people, American politicians who would thwart attempts to do effective things in what I would call, in this context, strategic counterintelligence vis-a-vis the Soviets, particularly in the area of technology transfer. That was a hard thing to do, and it was never done perfectly. But there was political opposition, not in the sense of, waving a political banner, but certain senators and certain members of Congress and certain members of the media tried to put the brakes on those things for whatever reasons. But they did, and going back in time, there were the whole crew of people that Professor Kengor up the road, or down the road from here, but up the road from there, wrote about dupes and fellow travelers and a whole taxonomy of people who became effectively supportive of the Soviets, particularly in these kinds of matters. Now, probably not as many as time went forward, but at one point that was a big deal. And it was a big deal during the 1930s. We're talking here with regard to China with technology transfer. One of the big things that happened in the 1930s is the United States willingly transferred technology after the recognition in 33, willingly transferred technology to the Soviet Union, but also had a heck of a lot of it stolen. More than is probably realized, certainly at the time, but even today, people don't comment on that much. But those who've gone back and looked at that, that was a huge deal of getting advanced technology to the Soviet Union. And I think there were a lot of people, well, there were a number of people certainly who favored doing that in the American political system. And a number of them did it. And look, there were a whole bunch of people who went to the Soviet Union as volunteers to help the Soviets with their, becoming a great power. Of course, under Stalin, a lot of them never came back. I mean, it wasn't a pleasant outcome for them. But they went over there bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and all idealistic. But there was also just a lot of stuff stolen. We don't make a big deal of it today, and then pretty soon, we were allies, and there was Lend-Lease and all of that. But even there, the Soviets got a lot of mileage, not only literally, but they got a lot of stuff out of Lend-Lease because there were a lot of people involved in the process who wanted them, wanted to help the Soviets. So I think that the political context on some of these things matter, to be sure. If we're going to see the professor's question, if we're going to see a strategic response to the Chinese strategic effort to become, one of the great powers, or a great power in their own backyard of Asia, which is a big backyard. We're going to have to come to some general agreement about this, and I'm not optimistic about that. I mean, we got a lot of problems in doing that. One, our country has become polarized in its political views, and in kind of a gut reaction way. If the Republicans say one thing, the Democrats don't like it. That means it's just gut reaction. When I worked on Capitol Hill with Professor Shulsky and some of the others in your audience, and it wasn't all that many years ago, everything was not a strict party line vote, to be sure. In fact, on matters of intelligence, you had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and you had all these different varieties, and they would come together on one issue, and then on another issue they'd be not in agreement. But it was a much more representative of what one would think in a school textbook case is kind of the way it should be. Today, it's just very bipolar, and I mean that in both senses of the word. And that's hard to get agreement on anything. The simplest thing today you can't get. I was giving a lecture last night, actually an IWP, was it last night or the night before, on FISA. And somebody said, well, why hasn't that been reformed? And, you've got all of these things that you need to do. Well, because you can't get a Republican and a Democrat to sit down and address the issue apart from their intense dislike of each other. Anyway, so that to me, Professor, would be that but is it possible to do it? Sure, it's possible to do it. And, Americans have done it before, and it sometimes, though, that takes the sense that you're in deep trouble. And with regard, in this case, to what, I think some of the Chinese activities. Chinese activities don't necessarily need to be as threatening as they are to the U.S., but since they are, we can't ignore it.
Thank you, Professor. And due to the limited time, we'll just take one more question.
Okay.
This is actually a series of questions. Do we need to reconstitute something like the old USIA to deal with the United Front Works Department efforts to distribute its propaganda and increase its political influence throughout the world? Would it be possible to create a new USIA? How could it harness the tremendous amount of soft power that is possessed by the US media, entertainment, universities, and etc.?
Well, this is a very tender question right now, since the previous administration attempted to make some reforms in the entire area of information, official U.S. government information. And the first thing that the new administration did was to fire everybody and reverse those things. So do we need to do that? Absolutely. But again, the reformers, some of whom are friends of the Institute, Dr. Bob Riley, went back into government in the last year, precisely to do this. And he and the gentleman who was the head of the whole, whatever it was called now, they were run out of office on the very first day. So there's another example of the extreme polarization. And we do need an American government coordination and strategy with regard to information and the radios and all of that stuff. We fought about those things in the government for years, partly political and in some cases just bureaucratic, but that's a glaring need. And if, particularly with regard to People's Republic of China, we need that. And I don't want to, this is not a political commentary, but I'm very disappointed with the new administration. So the first thing they did was get rid of the people who were in there trying to fix the situation at whatever the OGMA or whatever the new name is. That's not a helpful sign in my view. That's just my view.
Thank you, Professor de Graffenried, for such an insightful lecture today, and thank you, everyone, for raising so many important questions. I'd like to share the AILS upcoming event on April 14th with Dr. Patrick Cronin. He's an Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, and he'll be presenting about his report on fear and insecurity addressing North Korean threat perceptions. Again, thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you all on the 14th of April.